Hi everyone, Heather here, and today we're going to be answering my personal inquiry question from the book My Brigadista Years. So in the book My Brigadista Year, the main character Laura becomes a brigadista in Cuba, and she teaches the Cuban countryside literacy along with 100,000 other brigadistas from Cuba. While I was reading the book and afterwards when I was reflecting, my main question was, how is this program so successful in Cuba? They recruited over 100,000 volunteers to become teachers and teach in really harsh conditions in the Cuban countryside for free. And I also wanted to follow that with a different inquiry question. What can the U.S. learn from this in order to solve our own teacher shortages and to support our teachers here in the USA? So I think that one of the first big factors in the success of the recruitment of the brigadistas was patriotism in Cuba. So before the 1959 Cuban Revolution, where Castro took power in Cuba, there was a lot of distrust of the government in Cuba because of a lot of corruption that had happened in the government. Prior to Castro coming into the government, the former president, President Batista, had been president 2 times before that, and then in his third election, he used military power to take control of the country, which kind of directly opposed what he had been supporting prior to that. So it caused a lot of distrust between Batista and just the government in general and the people of Cuba. So then when Castro staged the 1959 Russian Revolution and coup, it was kind of like a chance to start over again. A lot of people trusted Castro because of his new political views that differed greatly from Batista's, and his emphasis on power for the people, because a lot of people had felt oppressed in the past political regime. So it brought in this whole culture of trusting the government and really loving the government. So with that said, a lot of younger Cubans who were like school-aged, for example, such as Laura, who wanted to pay honor to the government and show their support of the communist government, the Brigadistas was a great way in order to do that. They wanted to show their patriotism, and one way that young people could do that was enforcing the political ideology of communism by teaching everyone, including the poor in the countryside. And that leads me to my second point, and the second point is that in communism, the ideologies of education are hugely emphasized. One of my teachers at Western likes to repeat the phrase saber es poder, which in Spanish, or the English translation of that would be to know is to have power. And that's basically a very big tenet of communism. In communism, if the people have power, they are able to access the same power and wealth that the other educated people have. So it's really big that they educate the entire country. So the young people who became brigadistas were not only doing that just to teach literacy to all Cubans, but they were also doing that to endorse communism in their own way. Another reason that I found that the young people of Cuba were willing to become brigadistas, even though it was a completely volunteer organization, was because even though they weren't being paid, there was still financial benefits from joining the brigadistas. One of the most important of those benefits was free school after teaching for a year in the brigadistas. So in the book, for example, Laura's family, one of the main reasons they allow Laura to become a brigadista is because it'll help them out greatly later on with her tuition, because they know that's going to be really expensive. So for working class Cubans like Laura's family, allowing your children to become brigadistas not only meant that they would get that free tuition, which would help your livelihood, but they would also not have to care for the children for a year, feeding them and clothing them and providing for them because the children would be off teaching for that year. So it was financially beneficial in 2 different ways for them. And then to top things off, the government of Cuba highly endorsed young people going into the brigadistas during this time, obviously to enforce these ideas of communism, but also because they had had a big decline in the amount of intellectual power and professionals that stayed in Cuba after the 1959 revolution. A lot of the professionals and intellectuals at the time were supporters of Batista, or just were well supported by Batista. So after Batista was taken out of office, they either fled Cuba or were exiled from Cuba and removed by force. So Cuba was looking for a way to educate its population and regain that intellectual power again. So after thinking about and inquiring about the success of recruiting all of the brigadistas, I thought about how we could apply that success in recruitment of teachers to the United States. And the biggest thing that I think could help is a trust in the government and patriotism towards teaching. So in Cuba, one of the main motivations for young people to become teachers with the brigadistas was to help their government because they loved and trusted it so much. And they wanted to support the government by lending their time and lending their hand in teaching the poor people in the countryside. And it's important to mention again that this trust was kind of a side effect of the several different factors that came from Cuba with a politically corrupt background. But Cuba was able to use this new hope that they had developed in order to inspire people to become teachers with the brigadistas. I think if the U.S. government was able to spin teaching into a means of being patriotic, like the Cuban government was able to, that more people would be willing to become teachers because it would be a way to honor the government and honor this organization that they trust and they love so much. Secondly, I think that the U.S. government needs to take into consideration the communist ideals that Cuba held towards education. That's not to say that the U.S. government should become a communist government, because I don't believe that, but I do think that in communism, education is valued so much and viewed as this great equalizer, and if the U.S. government was truly going to believe that and was truly able to support that idea, then I think more people would feel supported in their decisions to become teachers. That is because even teachers that are working at schools that have a lot of issues and may need a lot more assistance would feel like they were a very important part of society because they were helping with this greater cause. And I think a final thing that the U.S. government can learn from the Brigadista movement in Cuba when thinking about solving our own teacher shortage is to compensate teachers well for the work they do. Even though Laura wasn't given a paycheck week to week per se, the financial benefits of becoming a brigadista were very, very great for her. So again, while brigadista families didn't get a paycheck, they didn't have to pay for tuition ever again for their children who became brigadistas, and they never had to pay for food or clothing for that whole year that their child was away as a brigadista. So that was a huge financial blessing and benefit for them. I think that if teachers were compensated in an equally as important way today by the U.S. government for becoming teachers, that more people would be willing to become teachers just because they would feel valued financially. Overall, I think that there were a lot of historical and cultural factors that led to the Brigadista movement being so successful that may not be able to be replicated in the United States, but I think that taking inspiration and taking specific parts of the Brigadista movement and applying them to our own education system here will be a really great idea. So thank you guys so much for listening to my inquiry project. Thanks so much for a great semester and have a good one. Bye.